everyone, and welcome. Sorry for the lateness, but we are here. And welcome to the Right Time Data Integration for MotherDuck webinar. My name is Dominic. I am the Content Marketing Manager here at Estuary, and I'm joined by our host, Zulf, who is our Head of Sales Engineering here at Estuary. Whether you're joining us in the beginning, middle, or end of your workday, thank you for carving out some time for us. This webinar is part of our Estuary 101 series designed to give people an overview of the Estuary product and our right time data philosophy. Today, we're going to be walking through a live end-to-end demo of a Postgres to MotherDuck pipeline using Estuary. And we're also going to have some time for a Q&A at the end. So if you have any questions, you can pop them in the chat, or if you want to hold on to them at the end, and we'll try to get to everyone. Cool. Yeah, Zulf, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Thank you, Dominic. It's a pleasure being here. I'm delighted to be presenting to you good folks today, wherever you're calling from. So good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. As Dominic mentioned, I will be running today's session. So I'll be walking you through some slides just to give you an intro into Estuary itself, and that will be followed by a quick demo of the products that gives you a good overview of how the product works as well and how it could potentially benefit you. So without further ado, let's quickly look at the agenda. As I mentioned, a quick slideshow. So we'll just talk about the company itself, and then the platform overview, its capabilities, followed by a live demo of what we talk about today. So let's just describe the situation what we have and what a lot of our most of our customers do experience in the organizations, whether it's small, medium, or enterprises. It's, you know, when it comes to data movement, there is a plethora of different solutions out there, all for different needs as well. You know, we see a lot of commonality when we talk about real-time data, that we look at, streaming solutions like Kafka. There are, change data capture solutions out there such as Golden Gate, or you might have an open source solution that's trying to do a combination of all ETL work, but again, not serving when you need that data itself. So we often see this kind of like spaghetti junction with different sources, different requirements, different departments, and different tools. So what does Estuary do here that's so different? Why look at Estuary itself? So the first thing is that we have one combined solution that does real-time streaming, CDC, change data capture, and batch within a single platform. There isn't a separate component for batch integration or another solution for CDC. What we're trying to eliminate here is the kind of disadvantage of having multiple solutions to manage, to maintain, to keep up with licenses and rising costs. So what we have here is one unified platform for all timely data integration needs. And having a capability that services quite a lot of systems where data does reside or where data needs to go to. And again, as we go through this presentation, we'll have a look at some of the connectors, both for sources and targets itself. Now, in terms of the company itself, I always describe Estuary as one of the new kids on the block. Not so new now, 5 years since we've started as an organization. But what I do like to emphasize is the product has been around for many years. It's been hardened in our co-founders' previous endeavor, where they created a company to provide marketing data to different marketing agencies. And that's where I guess the notion of Estuary was born, as well as surfacing marketing data, that there was a need to surface data that might reside in SaaS, in databases. In fact, a lot of critical data does reside in databases, so having a mechanism to acquire that data efficiently with minimal impact was also another theme that they saw as well. So the product, the back-end infrastructure for the product has been hardened over many years. And it wasn't until 2025 where we got our Series A funding. So we've actually used that funding to extend the building blocks of Estuary from an engineering point of view, as well as go-to-market point of view as well. So one of the things that we will talk about when we talk about Estuary, and you've mentioned me talk about certain timely data, right? We've talked about real-time, batch. Here at Estuary, we pride ourselves in calling it the right time data, as Dominic alluded to when he introduced the session itself. And right time is key for us. And what does that actually mean, right time data, right? A lot of people will say, well, we need real time. Other people will say, oh, we need batch. We don't necessarily need real time. Or do we need a combination of both, right? And so that's what Estuary is trying to service. That's what our motto is here. It's about when do you want that data? We have capabilities, as I mentioned, within a single platform to do batch, micro batch, CDC, streaming. Now, what you'll see is as we go on, we have a decoupled architecture. So the answer might not be just one. You may have different reporting requirements where you might have monthly reporting for billing information, for example, or if you're a retail organization looking at promotional offers, this might be regular within the day where you need it, maybe every second, every minute, maybe every hour. So there will be different needs for different endpoints or different requirements or different silos or infrastructures. So with Estuary, you've got that choice of, do we need to do streaming, or do we need to do batch, or do we need to do a combination of both, right? And as we look at the architecture, you'll see the flexibility that we'll have in there. So right time data is about servicing the business of, when do we actually need that data? Does it make sense to do streaming? You'll see in some organizations where you do streaming from source to target, necessarily the target, if it's a data warehouse, does it make sense to do streaming there? It could be costly. I mean, there's certainly use cases for it, but does it make sense for all your data to be streaming into a data warehouse, for example, right? So we're going to have a look at what controls are there for you as an end user within Estuary to control when you acquire that data and when you want to implement that data downstream. So let's have a look at the architecture, because that's a nice segue now into talking about where you want that control, right? And today's webinar not only does it introduce you to Estuary, but also in relation to MotherDuck as well. And MotherDuck is one of our biggest partners here, as well as other vendors that I'll mention and call out as we go along. And so when we talk about MotherDuck, again, do we want the data to be streamed in there? Do we want it batching? And we'll talk about that. But in terms of our architecture, Estuary's architecture, there remain three components within the data pipeline. The capture, as the name suggests, it will capture from your source. Now, we'll have a look in the next couple of slides what connectors we have, and you'll see there is a choice. So let's take Postgres, for example. When you type in Postgres, you will be given a choice of what flavor of Postgres, and whether you want that Postgres connector to be real-time or batch. So again, here we're emphasizing, when does it make sense for you to acquire that data? Now, a lot of the times when we talk about databases, change data capture does come at the forefront. There's legitimate reasons why. Change data capture has a minimal impact on the databases as it's reading the logs, or WAL in this case from Postgres, and then delivering change data along the data pipeline, as opposed to reading tables directly and moving incremental batch jobs, maybe based on a timestamp column, right? So it's a lot more efficient, it's a lot more lightweight, it's not hitting the database itself. So it kind of makes sense why some people will go with a change data capture mechanism for sources. But again, there's legitimate reasons to do batch extractions. CDC may not support all data types, for example. So you may have to get that data via batch connector directly from the tables and move that data along. So with Estuary, you will have that choice. Do we want to use CDC or do we want to use batch? Now, let's take, for argument's sake, we go with CDC and we tell Estuary we're going to use this real-time connector. Now, as with any CDC tool, when you want to do that on the source databases, there are prerequisites that need to be satisfied. So, just some examples are setting Postgres to logical in order to do that. There's obviously a dedicated database user with privileges to access the source system tables. Those are just commonly across the board. But for a full list, and I'll show you this later on, we can either look at the UI or directly into Estuary's website, where you can get documentation to list out what are all the pre-requirements for a source database, for example, right? So as soon as that database, as soon as we've set up that connector for that database, as soon as a transaction is committed using CDC, Estuary will pick that up via the capture job. And as it goes through our data pipeline, we'll put this into the middle, which is our collections. We can also do we can also perform transformations in the middle. And we'll look at that transformation capability later on. But also within that collections, this is where we temporarily store the data that we collect from source. So we do persist it into cloud storage. We always recommend from Estuary's best practice that you set up your own cloud storage for this. By default, Estuary's own cloud storage, we only keep data for 20 days and then it's deleted. But like I said, for those of you that are more security conscious, it's best to have your own cloud storage set up there. So data is presided within your infrastructure and you have control over the security of that data, but more importantly as well, the retention policy of that data as well. So I'll come back to this point around collections, but I always describe it as a live data lake or treat it as archive log files. And again, I'll come back to that point in a minute. So we capture that data in real time from Postgres, we persist it into collections, into cloud storage, and then the last component, the materialization, will pick up the incoming transactions into collections in near real time and propagate that to the target, in this case, MotherDuck. Now, again, in the target, you will have capabilities. Some of our connectors will be real-time, but you also have a choice of if you want to apply that data real-time. So maybe MotherDuck, for this reporting instance, it's maybe required for weekly reports. Maybe we do batches on the target. So maybe we can control that maybe, once every hour. But you have that control in there. So end to end, the point being here is as we capture the data, we can decide whether we want that in real time or batch. When we apply that data, again, we can decide we want to apply that data straight away or do we want to do it in incremental batches. So it's not necessarily what we're saying here is that you do all or nothing. You have a choice, both from a source and a target perspective or individual data pipeline perspective as well. Now, having said what right time is in this scenario, let's talk a bit more about this architecture and why we have these three main components. So like most other companies out there, they'll have a capture materialize. What makes us different is the collections in the middle where we persist the data temporarily onto disk or storage, or in this case, may not be temporary, but we might assign a retention period in there. And this allows us to decouple our architecture. So now we'll put in end-to-end real-time into MotherDuck. For whatever reason, just say the cloud environment goes down on the target. Now, our materialization job will have to stop because it can't communicate with the target. However, because this architecture is decoupled, it doesn't prevent your capture from going down. Right here in this scenario, only your materialization task goes down, but your capture still continues to process that data it captures and persists this into cloud storage. So what does that mean from an infrastructure point of view? Well, your DBAs will be happy because there's no, downtime on the capture where we might have to go back into backup log files or, archive log files to read that transaction. But even a worst case scenario, that transaction doesn't exist during the downtime. And that means you have to reload the data in order to synchronize it back to the target, right? So from an infrastructure point of view, there's a low TCO there. There's no need to redo bulk loads again to sync up your target because the capture is putting that into collections, and our materialize will have its own checkpoint there, so it just replays from where we left off. The other thing from a cost point of view, because you're keeping up with real-time transactions, again, you're minimizing doing the initial loads. And again, that can be a cost, not only from an infrastructure point of view, but also from a monetary point of view, because you're going to pay for all that data movement across the data pipeline. So that's one of the biggest benefits of having a decoupled architecture and having collections in place. The other point that I'll make here is a lot of our customers, when they take that data, they might not have one centralized target, for example, MotherDuck. They may have, there are going to be other requirements that we see coming down the stream, and MotherDuck's going to be our main platform where we want to put that data and do a lot of analytics. But they could be, kind of self-service ad hoc kind of requirements down the line. So we also want to put this into, things like Kafka, for example. So we can also stream it into Kafka, and then whoever needs to have that data can subscribe to it and publish their own kind of reporting. So what you're having here is an architecture where you've got multiple different destinations. Now, a lot of the other solutions out there, that's fine, you can do that. It means that you need to set up a new data pipeline and capture from the same source again. Now, what you're doing here is you're going to have two capture tasks reading from the same database, which puts more load. Now, your DBAs are going to be concerned. The more load that goes into that database, the more risk of downtime that incurs or more resources being chewed up. Now, if it's an operational database that's critical to the organization, you know yourself that's a red flag straight away. Now, with Estuary, because, as I said, we've got this decoupled architecture, we persist data into collections, we can put a retention policy. Now, providing we've got a long enough retention policy in collections, you can replay transactions from your collections without having to go back to your source. So in this example, I want to set up not only MotherDuck, but Kafka downstream as well. Now, provided I've still got the data and collections, I'm not going to go back to my source. I'm going to tell the second materialization job to start reading from my collections. So that's capture the data once with a single task and use multiple times downstream. So it's a one-to-many topology. So that's the other benefit this decoupled architecture can give you. If you have, many targets that you want to service with the same source, you don't have to create multiple capture jobs again on that same source itself. Now let's take a look at the deployment options that you have within Estuary. Now we have three. We have public, private, and bring your own cloud. Public is the most common one that a lot of customers will be familiar with because of other solutions out there. This is our SaaS offering. So there's two parts to this as well that I want to clarify. There's the control plane, and then there's a data plane. What's the difference between the two? The control plane in Estuary is where you will log on into a UI, web-based UI. This is where you'll do all your configuration, your monitoring, your manageability of your whole Estuary ecosystem. The data plane is where the data physically gets executed. So once you've created your data plane and you want to execute that data, that will be based on Estuary's data planes across the globe. Our data centers are in the US and the EU itself. So again, that's all controlled by Estuary itself. Now, for those of you that are more security conscious or compliance or regulation conscious as well, you may not be able to use third-party data planes or what's the word I'm looking for? Data centers to execute that data. You'll have something that you want within your own region or maybe within your own infrastructure. And that's where private and bring your own cloud comes in. This allows you to deploy a dedicated data plane for you specifically. Now, the difference between private and bring your own cloud is who's going to actually stand up the resources. With private, Estuary will spin up the necessary account, and we support AWS, Google, and Azure. So depending on what your preference is, let's say, for example, AWS, we'll create an empty account, we'll spin up the VPC in there, create all the resources, deploy our code, and create that data plane for you, and we'll give you access of that private data plane within your UI. Bring your own cloud is taking all those benefits, but it's not Estuary spinning up the resources. That's coming at the end user's resources now. So you can say, well, I've got a special deal with AWS where I've got these credits that I can reuse to create this account. So let me create this empty account and let me give Estuary privileges to access the empty account. So you can create the VPC, deploy your code, and create the data plane and still manage it for us as if it was a managed service, but we control the resources. So that's the difference between private and bring your own cloud. Is who spins up or who gives access to those resources, right? Who spins up the account. But in all instances, it's all going to be a managed service that Estuary performs in looking after that data plane. It's whether you want a private data plane and whether you want to spin up the resources or get Estuary to do that. That's the only difference. Okay, let's look at connectors. So I mentioned earlier on. So historically, as I mentioned, we started off with marketing data, and we've expanded that incredibly so over the years into different types of connectors through SaaSes, finances, marketing applications, databases, HR applications, CRM applications. Right now, we have 200 plus different connectors, and we're always introducing every core new connectors. And part of our roadmap as well this year, there's a lot of SaaS connectors we wish to include, to incorporate, as well as database connectors as well. And we can talk about that as well a bit later on. So there are 200 plus different connectors. You can go on our website. You can actually, there's a directory in there, so you can see if there's anything listed that's supported. If not, there are other options, which I'll touch on in just a bit. And also access to the documentation. So as I mentioned, certain connectors, you'll have prerequisites to satisfy in order to use those connectors, especially around change data capture. So our documentation will list this out. Now, I did mention, the directory. If there's a connector in there that you have that you don't see listed, does that mean Estuary can't help? Well, not necessarily. There are a couple of options here. First of all, you can contact Estuary, see if there's any plans in the roadmap to include the technology concerned with. The other option is Estuary has a CDK framework as well, and we're actually looking in the next couple of months to enhance that capability. But there's, again, possible conversations that a connector can be built either by yourselves or by Estuary as well. But that's something we can park and talk down the line if you're interested in doing something like that. That's where I advise you to get in contact with an Estuary representative and have further conversations. But if it's not listed on our website, it doesn't necessarily mean there's nothing that Estuary can do. So hopefully that gives you a good overview of the architecture and the capabilities. What we're going to look at next is the UI for Estuary. So talk about some of the things that I mentioned about the components within our architecture, the deployment options as well, and we'll show some data moving between Postgres and MotherDuck as well. So those are the two technologies. Let me just switch screens. So hopefully we're still sharing. And what we're going to do now, actually, before I go into the UI itself, let me just show you some Postgres. This is part of the demo. I'd just like to show that there is actual data that we are going to be moving across. What we have on my source Postgres is just a sample data that I collect. This is about my, I'll put my fingers in quotes, my mover collection that I have. So there's about 10 rows of data in there that exists. And I've also got a script that we're going to be performing some changes as well to show you, real-time data movement itself. So that is my source infrastructure, and I'll show you the target in just a little while. But let's just go to the UI itself. So as I mentioned, from a control plane point of view, if I go into here, that's MotherDuck. Apologies. There we go. And I'll show you MotherDuck in a second. So in terms of the UI, in fact, when we first log into the UI, we'll be presented with a welcome. But before I go through the UI itself, let's talk about accessing Estuary. So in our website, you'll see a button there to say try Estuary, and you'll click on that, and it will walk you through a couple of steps. One of the steps that will be required is creating an organization name or a tenant name in Estuary. So in my example, I have Zulf-demo/. That is my primary tenant name. Everything that I create from this point onwards will be under that tenant name itself. So you can give this a meaningful name based, again, if it's an organization you work for, you can give it the company name, or if it's just your own trial that you want to conduct offline, then you can put something meaningful in there based on what you're going to recognize. So in my case, it's Zulf-demo. I'll just highlight that straight off the bat. So in here, again, it gives you a good high-level overview of the number of connectors that you've got running and collections that you've got as well. I'll show you this as we go step by step. But on the left-hand side is your main navigation pane, and it's very much like our architecture that I showed you in the presentation slide, that we have sources, collections, destinations. So that's the capture and the materialization, as well as collections in the middle. We also have an admin tab in here, and let me just walk you through that. So the first person that actually signs up to Estuary for an organization, they'll create their tenant name based on, more than likely their organization they work for. From that point onwards, if they want to add other users to that same tenant name, they can do this from the admin tab here. So again, taking myself as an example, I've got 2 different email addresses. You can go ahead and start adding new users in here. So as you go to add users, it will say, right, what kind of permissions do you want to give them to? Create the link, and then you can forward that link onto them. And once they click on that, they'll have access to the tenant itself. And again, you can actually restrict what kind of grants and privileges they have in here as well. So let's add in users. Again, you can get granular with the grant accesses for the tenant or subtenants that can be created. In here as well, under settings, you'll also get access to cloud storage that you're using. And as I mentioned earlier on, best practice when you're using Estuary, again, especially if you deploy it in production, is to use your own cloud storage. So in here, you can get access to our docs that will tell you how to set up cloud storage for either Amazon, Azure, or Google Cloud. and then from that on, you can map your own cloud storage into here. So Estuary will use that moving forward. I'm using public data plane, so this is a SaaS offering. But as I mentioned, we do have private bring your own cloud that has your own dedicated data plane. In that, once that's created for you by Estuary support, it will be listed in here as well. So it will be part of the option when you go to assign your connectors to be executed by a certain data plane. It will come up in that data list, that drop-down list. And then there's other information around billing that you can also see in here as well. So let's look at sources. And as I mentioned, this is going to be a blank canvas when you first start off with, but you'd go to create a new capture. You'd type in the search what capture you're interested in. As I mentioned earlier on about Postgres, there's different flavors, but also different types of connectors in terms of how often do you want to capture the data. Do you want to use change data capture, which is our real-time connector here, which is always based on recommended, or we also have a batch connector in here. So we give you that ability to say how often you want to acquire that data, real-time or in batches. Now let's just choose the real-time, for example, and go through this. Now, as I mentioned, everything will be created under my tenant name that's been created in here. So I'd give this a naming convention. Webinar can be used in here as well. So I've used previously. And this is where you decide, right, which data plane do I wish to execute this against? Now I'm using the public data plane. We have several across the globe in the EU and in the US with different cloud providers. That list will continue to expand as we develop across. And there's plans this year to add more with different regions and other cloud vendors like Azure as well. Now, once you've decided which data plane you wish to execute this in, or if you've got your own private data plane, that will also show up in the list. Then, again, depending on which connector you specified, SaaS connectors will have different options to database. CRMs, again, will have different requirements for connection. So based on the connector that you've chosen for the source, the endpoint configuration will be slightly different for each. But the main point here is, right, what do we need to do in order to connect to this technology on the source? One of the things that I'll highlight as part of the connection as you go through this to connect to Postgres is a lot of the databases will have this option here, history mode. And I just want to clarify this while we're here as well. What does history mode do? It's not like what other solutions class history mode as. In this essence, what Estuary does by default when it captures data, it takes the final state of what that data looks like on the source and just moves that across. So, for example, we have a primary key, and that primary key has been updated, say, 5 times. Rather than taking all 5 updates, we just take the 5th update, the last, the exact value that we have now in the source, and move that across. And there's very good reasons why we do that by default, is because there's less data that moves across the data pipeline, which in turn saves you cost in terms of moving that data. However, in saying that, there are legitimate reasons why you want to move maybe all transactions. So, if there's that primary key and it's had 5 updates, for example, you might want to push all those 5 dates across, because maybe on the target you've got an audit table or history table that needs to have every single transaction captured. So if you do need that use case, you can click on history mode and it will capture every single transaction, not just the final state. Then once you've specified your connection into Postgres, there will be certain options in here. I mean, if I look at advanced, for example, this is going to be very specific to Postgres, where you might want to put in a publication name and slot name as well. And then there'll be other specific options associated within Postgres. So for example, if you want to do an initial load based on a certain point in time, maybe use an xmin value, you can specify that in here as well. And just to clarify terminology, when I move forward with Estuary, when I talk about doing backfill, that is the initial load, moving the existing data that's in the source and moving that across to the target before we do change data capture. So backfill means initial load. And then once we're ready, and connected to our technology of choice, then we need to tell Estuary what is it that we want to move from the source. So if I just look at my existing configuration for Postgres and scroll down past the endpoint configuration, here you can see I'm specifying, or basically I have access to these tables in the source. This is what I want to replicate across. And you can be selective at this point as well to say, right, these are the tables I'm interested in. By default as well, we'll have schema evolution enabled. So if there's any structural changes that happens in the source, Estuary will keep up with those structural changes and again, propagate that downstream without you having to worry about breaking data pipelines because something, on the source has changed without you knowing from a schema point of view. So that is enabled by default. And yes, here we can be very selective about what tables we want to move across. And then we say save, publish, and then Estuary will go ahead and execute and create that task on the source. So what we've done here is we've created the first task to capture data from Postgres, and automatically will create collections based on the tables that we're acquiring to reside that data onto cloud storage. And I'll come back to this point as well. So here's a high-level overview of our capture job. Here, right off the bat, I can see it's for Postgres. We can see the volume of data that we've captured and the number of rows we've captured. If I click on that capture, I can drill down and get more information in here. So I can see earlier on in the day, there was 10 transactions that went across. Funny, that's the same amount that I had in the source, and then there was another insert that went on here as well. So at granular level, I can see, right, that was my backfill, and then there was one insert that went through. And we're going to have a look at that a bit more. So that's a high-level overview, data volume moving. Alerts can be enabled in here as well. So we can have alerts for data hasn't moved X amount of time. We haven't sent in the data. Please let me know. Or if there's any task failures, again, you'll be informed as well. And we'll talk about monitoring a bit later on as well. There's a lot of things that Estuary will be bringing out in the next weeks, months as well around monitoring as well. Slowly, we're going to be introducing new capabilities in there. We can also view the spec. So this is anything that we do in the UI. We also, in the back end, do this in YAML files as well. So you can see what that spec would look like. We also have a client capability, not just the UI, which we call flow control. So all this can be done via files as well. And here we can also view the logs in real time and see what Estuary is doing in the background. So that's the source. The capture is running. We've got 11 transactions. So that's the 10 original data points that we had in there. And if I just refresh that view as well, because there was an insert I did just before starting this webinar, just to make sure everything was working, you can see here. That's the 11th transaction, just to make sure that was still correct. So having to go back to Estuary, we can see that there was 11 records in there. Now, in collections, as I mentioned, collections will be created automatically. As soon as we start capturing data, and data is there to be collected, we'll put that into collections. So you'll see a collection for every table that's been created. In my case, we just have one. And again, high-level overview, I can see, from a data point of view, the volume of data or the number of rows. Also in here, there's additional information I can glean. So what data plane executed this from the source, type date, time, date stamp as well. But more importantly, I can see some data lineage here. So within collections, I can see, right, this capture job was responsible for collecting all this data. This typically, first time you set it will be blank because we haven't done anything in theory for the target. But because I've done this in advance, I can see the lineage between source and target that's reading this data as well. Now, in here as well, I can view the data. So this is specific data that we're capturing and some values in there. The next step, so that's stage one, that's the first stage. We've created a capture, it's going off, it's reading the source, it's putting this into collections itself. The next step is materialization, and this is exactly like the source as well. So I can see here a list, I can type in different, technologies. So Elasticsearch, for example, if I wanted to nail that down, it's in there already, I can see it, but we can drill down in here, or MotherDuck, for example, which I also can see in the main page, but let's drill it down in here. And again, this is real time, but does it necessarily mean we have to do real time downstream? No. And you'll see this within the options. So again, I can give this a naming convention, the data plane I wish to execute the materialization job against, credentials to connect to MotherDuck. And here's where I'm going to list out some options as well. By default, Estuary will apply transactions using soft deletes. Now, for those of you that are not familiar with soft deletes, let me just explain very quickly. So Inserts will get replicated as inserts. Updates, again, will update the record on the target. If we see a delete record, what Estuary does on the target by default is it will create additional columns like the op type, time, date stamp, and it won't physically delete that record on the target. What it will say is we've seen this delete operation, and we'll mark it to say it was, it was marked for deletion, but we won't have physically delete that record downstream. So that's what we do by default, soft deletes. However, there are other options as well. So if you do want to physically delete that record on your target, we have an option here that you can enable. So this will allow you to do hard deletes downstream. If that's not enabled, we'll do soft deletes, and that's explained in here as well in the description. Again, this is going to be very specific to MotherDuck, that from a configuration point of view, we also need a storage bucket for MotherDuck. And that's all within our documentation as well. It'll walk you step by step what's required. Now here is where you can be specific. Now, by default, as I mentioned, this connector is real time for downstream, but here you can actually be very specific and say, do I want to do real time, or do I want to be very specific on when I want to play that data, what time zone I want to play that data, between what times do I want to move this data, between start time, end time, and what days do I want to move this data. So again, you can be very granular how often you apply that data. So you may, in this essence, want to do real-time CDC from Postgres, but maybe delayed applying to MotherDuck, which makes sense. As I mentioned, the benefits of using CDC downstream, that it's non-invasive on the source infrastructure. But maybe for MotherDuck downstream, for analysis, it may not require streaming. It may require, maybe every half an hour, for example. So you can be very granular about that. And then also, if you have other downstream, and this is not actually in here, but we'll talk about this as well. So some of our clients also use tools like Coalesce to do further transformations downstream. And so we're going to be adding that capability of Coalesce, where you can actually schedule orchestration or other ETL tools to perform transformations once we've loaded data in there. Once you've entered your credential information, this is another point I would like to highlight as well. By default as well, we do mirrored schema, naming convention. What does that mean again? So allow me to explain. If I'm capturing from Postgres source and the schema, I'm using the default schema, for example, which is public, and I want to copy the table name, so I want to do a lift and shift. By default with Estuary, we do a mirrored schema. And basically that means in the downstream, we're going to copy the same schema name and table names. So we're not going to look at the schema name that we've used in our configuration. We're just going to apply everything that we've got from the source. So here we've got examples. If we have schema name and table name like this is what we're going to do downstream. However, in my case, and I'll show you my configuration very quickly. So if I go back into destinations and let's edit my MotherDuck connector. If I go into config in here, you can see the database schema that I'm going to use there is the default MotherDuck one, main. So what this means is in the target, I don't want to use public. I want to use main, but I want to copy the same table names in here. So what I've done here is I've shifted the naming convention. Instead of using mirror schemas, I've just said use table name only. And in that essence, what Estuary is going to do, it's going to copy the same table names, but when it comes to applying to the schema, it's going to get that detail from here itself, where I've actually put schema name main. And then I'm just basically saying, by default, this will be blank, but in here, you'll be adding all the collections you wish. So again, because we capture everything, it doesn't necessarily mean that you have to apply everything. Obviously, if you've got one-to-one data pipelines, then you may do. But if you've got several different materialization jobs going to different schemas or different technologies, you may want to segregate that data. So again, here you can be very collective, subjective, and granular and say, these are the collections that I wish to include in my materialization job. And so you'll add those collections in here, and then you'll say, right, okay, in terms of metadata, here's what we're capturing by default. Do I want to include some of this? Do I want to remove some of this? Do I want to add some of this as well? Because this is soft deletes, as I mentioned, we'll do flow publish stat, that's timestamp, and then we'll do meta-op as well. So that will describe what the transaction mix is, whether it's not, insert, update, or delete itself. So I've got this going on. Again, here you can see some metrics in here. Now, ideally, it's a one-to-one mapping. Metrics should match 11 inserts. So what do we see on the target side of things? So let's go into MotherDuck now. So as I mentioned, it's using soft deletes. So you can see the timestamp in here that the first 10 records was the initial load that I did. That was the 10 existing records I had. Then just before starting this webinar, I did a quick insert. And that's, again, you can see the timestamp in here just before we start this webinar. We're using UTC, not BST. I'm based out of the UK, so we've just gone 1 hour forward this weekend. So you can see from a time perspective, I can see this first 10 records was the bulk load, and then I did a quick insert itself. So as part of this now, what I want to do is some different transactions to show you the mix, what we do by default as well. So let's go back into Postgres very quickly, and let's go back to our script. So I can do an update in here, but you know what? Let me just go straight to a delete. Let me execute that query. We've deleted that from source. If I refresh that, I can see that record has now gone. I can very quickly look at Estuary, and I'll refresh that view to show you the metrics. But before, let's go straight into here and just see real time that should have happened. Now, what you see here, instead of deleting that record, you can see the timestamp. Sorry, not timestamp. Timestamp has changed as well, but we can see the op type has changed. So by default, as I said earlier on, we won't physically delete that record. We will just mark it was marked for deletion. So you've got a record of here that it was marked for deletion. And if you do wish to physically delete that record, we can actually do that in Estuary itself. One quick other option I want to show you as well. So as well as doing hard deletes, I mentioned earlier on that customers downstream may want to create audit or history tables, right? Now for that to operate within Estuary, what you need to do is for every transaction you get, you need to convert into an insert. And that can be done in Estuary as well. So by default, I mentioned soft deletes, we showed you hard deletes. In here, we've got delta updates. So this is the third option. By enabling this option, what happens here is every transaction that we see, regardless of it's an update or a delete, we will record that as an insert downstream as well. So that's how you can create audit and history tables within Estuary as well. So those are the three options how we can present the target how we present the data in the target itself. Soft deletes, hard deletes, and we can do slowly changing dimension type too as well. So hopefully this gives you a good overview of Estuary, the capabilities. I've shown you an end-to-end, real-time data movement. But as I mentioned, this is about right-time data movement. So it doesn't need to be real-time all the way through. You can dictate how often you want to capture that data and how often you want to apply that data itself. So let's go back and let's just finish off the slides. And oops, let's present that again. And we're going to swap the presenter view. So if this has piqued your interest, you've liked what you've seen, I do encourage you to get in contact with us. There's a couple of different methods here. You can use our sales email address, sales@estuary.dev. And you can also use our social media channels as well to connect with us or have a look at other material. We're always posting things on LinkedIn, new demos on YouTube as well. You can visit us directly on our website. You'll get a wealth of information in there. As I mentioned, connectors will have a directory in there. You can also go to docs.estuary.dev, and that will give you access to our documentation, all again available from our website. And we also have a Slack channel where we can engage with you as well. For those of you that also try or do a test on Estuary, a trial with us, you've got your own flexibility to do that on your own. And if you do, I do encourage you to look at our Slack channel as well. You can get support from there. But more importantly, we would also ask you to come and visit us, talk to our sales representative. We can walk you through the step. We're building out a sales engineering organization to help with POCs as well. So again, we can go into more depth about your testing, your needs, your requirements, and best practices as well. So there's a couple of ways of connecting with us itself. So thank you for your patience. I believe we'll leave this for Q&A. Dominic, I'll open the line up to you back again, see if there's...
Yeah, thank you. Actually, can you go back to the, let's just keep it on that slide for people just in case they want the links. I also do want to make a note. We are also going to be attending Snowflake Summit June 1st through the 4th. So if you're going to be there, the Snowflake Summit, come say hi to us. We'll be at Snowflake Row. But yeah, this was awesome. Thanks, Zulf. I have a few questions compiled for us, but if anyone also has questions, please feel free to drop in the chat. So our first question we have is, What does Estuary need on the source side to enable CDC? Are there database settings or are there permissions that teams often forget to configure?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I did touch on it earlier on, but it's a very good point because I see that all the time when people come to testing databases that they don't set that up properly and CDC doesn't work. But yes, for change data capture on certain databases, again, it's not a blanket for all databases, but certain databases will have their own requirements depending on what the options are chosen. But usually, typically, CDC needs to be enabled on that source infrastructure. I know for Postgres, you need to change the the level to logical, for example. With Oracle, you do need to enable supplemental login. Without that, you cannot do change data capture full stop. So there are things from a database level that needs to be satisfied, but also from a user perspective, grants perspective, we always recommend creating a dedicated user for replication rather than using something existingly. Now, when you do create that, you do need to provide certain grants and access rights to that user so it can access the databases to read those logs and capture data specifically for the tables that you want to replicate across. So I'll always encourage you to read our documentation first to see what's required for the connector. Even SaaS connectors will have their own specific requirements as well. So read the documentation, see what's required. Again, engage with us, engage within our Slack channel, and we can guide you along the process. But yes, things do need to be set up both for source and target as well.
Awesome. We have another question. You mentioned a little bit earlier about monitoring. I know you mentioned, I know we have some new features coming down the line later this year, but right now, what does monitoring and observability look like inside Estuary? And how would a data engineer know if their pipeline's healthy without having to babysit it in the platform?
That was a great question. Yes, you're right. I did touch on it and I was supposed to expand on it. So we showed you some metrics that you could use from the UI directly itself in terms of like the data movement. I showed you the kind of alerts that's set in there. Within the admin tab as well, we can actually set notifications, so email addresses where notifications can go to. You can also set up Slack to be that point of notification as well. And so right now, that's what's available within the UI. As I mentioned, as the coming weeks come and months go as well, there's several different elements to this that we're going to slowly be introducing. There's a lot more around alerting that's going to be introduced that you can manage via the UI itself. But one thing I wanted to mention was in our documentation, if you wanted to create your own alerts or notification or kind of mechanisms for self-managing Estuary and being alerted if anything goes wrong, we do have an open metrics API that you can plug in. So any metric that you can get from Estuary, you can plug into your own monitoring solutions like Grafana or Prometheus or Datadog, for example. So you can actually create your own metrics and monitoring dashboards out of that as well. It's instead of just using Estuary and having the UI up and running, right? You can do this in the background as well.
Awesome. Yeah, I know we also just announced a new alerting type, I think, within the platform last month. We had it in our last newsletter. Awesome. Cool. We have another question. What does pricing look like at a high level? I know you kind of mentioned the free trial, and we do have our pricing information on our website, but what does that look like? Is it consumption-based? Is it connector-based, seat-based? And how is this maybe going to look at the enterprise versus a smaller business?
Yeah, no, very great question. Great question. Pricing does come up quite a lot. And what I'll say, again, high level, if you want to go drill into specific use cases and get precise quotes, again, encourage you to contact us, get in hold of one of our sales representatives and we can walk you through that. But at a high level, we try to make it as easy as possible, right? We don't use monthly active rows or anything like that. So just taking a step back, we mentioned the deployment options. We mentioned that there was a public, which is our SaaS offering, and there was private, bring your own cloud. Each of those deployment options will have their own variances of how it's licensed and costed. Typically, with private, bring your own cloud, it's a subscription-based model, whereas the public SaaS offering can be pay-as-you-go or a subscription. Benefits of going through subscription, again, it depends on your monthly spend. It may be beneficial to do a yearly subscription, but the metrics that we use to calculate your licensing is based on the number of connectors, i.e., what connectors you're using to acquire data on the source and what connectors you want for your destination. So it's the number of connectors plus the volume of data that you move in a month. And typically we don't really include, right, I'll be careful what I say. I'll leave it as that, volume of data. So it's number of connectors, both as source and targets, and the volume of data that you move in a month. And that could be in gigabytes or terabytes. Dominic, you mentioned as well, we have a pricing calculator, which is more for our pay-as-you-go subscription. And you'll see the metrics in there that it asks you the number of connectors and volume data, and it will spit out what your monthly spend should be. Again, if you're more interested in the long-term, contractual element where you've got an annually contract and you can figure out what your spend is from a yearly point of view, get in touch with our sales representatives, and we can thresh that out as well.
Awesome. And yeah, last question. This one, I'm curious. What is on our roadmap that you're most excited about? I know we have some things in the pipeline, no pun intended, for things coming down the line. But yeah, is there anything that current users should know is on the way?
Yeah, that's that's what excites me as well. So I've had a chance to sit down with Dave, our CEO, and Johnny, our CTO, and discuss some of the things that's important to our customers, and what we see in the enterprise as well. And monitoring was a big one I mentioned. So there are certain things that we've done around alerting, and we're going to be doing kind of like task ready alertings. That's not right now in the UI. For people that are testing Estuary right now, they can subscribe to that, but we'll be introducing that in the UI very soon. The other things that's really exciting for me is the connectors that we're looking at. So we're planning to introduce a lot more database connectors. We introduced DB2 just recently this year as well. That's something that we previously didn't support. So we've got that out now. We're going to be enhancing those connectors. Right now it's batch. But we are going to be looking at a real-time connector, so a change data capture for DB2. We're currently expanding the capabilities of our existing connectors around SQL Server and Oracle, and we're looking to develop an agent-based native connector as well, which I'm really excited about. My background in this space, I've worked over the last 20 years in the data integration space, working for companies like Golden Gate, HVR, and something that made those companies very unique was having this capability of doing native reads, and it's not very common out there. It's a very hard thing to do, and Estuary is taking on that challenge, and we're hoping to announce special things in the coming months. So I'm very excited about those connectors, but as well as within the product, AI is a big thing, and we also help with AI use cases as well as large language models as well, that it constantly needs to be fed with data, and if it's real time it's even better, but it's large volumes of data as well. But we're also doing internal things within our product to include AI to make pipeline creation, transformation capabilities a lot more efficient and streamlined, and for non-technical users as well. So you're going to be seeing as the months and years go by, there's a lot of AI that's going to be introduced in our product as well. So those are the kind of things that excites me, and why I'm happy to always talk about Estuary and emphasize, why we're going to be leaders in this space with the things that we're doing.
For sure, yeah, it's an exciting year for us. I'm excited to see the things that we're going to be rolling out in the coming months. Cool. Well, that's all the questions I had compiled. Does anyone have any other questions for Zulf before we conclude this webinar? I will give a minute for anyone to think or ponder. Speak now or forever hold your peace. But also, if you think of something for the fact, you can always reach out to us, and we'll be happy to answer any questions. Going once. Going twice. All right. Well, I think that concludes today's webinar. Thank you so much, everyone, for attending. Thank you, Zulf, for being our wonderful host. This was awesome.
Pleasure.
And yeah, feel free to reach out to us, contact our sales team if you're interested in learning more about the product and you want to explore what that could look like. Like I mentioned again, we will be at Snowflake Summit in a few months in June, so come say hi to us there. And yeah, keep an eye out for future events and content from Estuary. Awesome. Well, have a great day, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us.